Will Singapore be absorbed by Malaysia? Relax. Breathe. Nobody is marching tanks across the causeway tomorrow. There will be no flag swap at Marina Bay, no sudden rebranding of CPF into something that sounds friendlier but pays worse. And yet, the fact that this question even exists tells you something uncomfortable. Singapore is a financial city-state, not a country in the emotional sense. It survives on capital flows, property prices, stock indices, and the collective belief that the spreadsheet will always balance. The moment people stop believing, the moment the numbers wobble, the fantasy cracks. Malaysia, meanwhile, is not poorer because it is weak. It is poorer because it is structurally different. Bigger land, bigger population, messier politics, more real economy, less financial theatre. One produces capital density, the other produces human density. History is full of cases where finance-heavy microstates eventually depend on their hinterlands, whether they admit it or not. Let's be clear before the comment section combusts. No, Singapore will not be absorbed by Malaysia in a legal or military sense. That's cartoon geopolitics for people who think borders move because of vibes. But economic absorption, that's already happening, quietly, without flags or speeches. Look at the flow of money. Singaporean capital parks itself in Johor real estate. Malaysian labour crosses the border daily to keep Singapore running. Developers price condos, assuming foreign demand forever. Banks lend as if wage growth is guaranteed by divine right. Stock valuations quietly assume stability is a permanent law of physics. This is not sovereignty. This is interdependence with denial, and denial is expensive, very expensive. Especially when your entire national wealth is tied up in three things advertisers love: stocks, property, and financial services. Here's the dangerous fantasy nobody talks about. Singapore doesn't need to be invaded to lose leverage. It only needs slower capital inflows, a property correction that doesn't bounce, aging demographics squeezing CPF, returns regional competitors offering cheaper, hungrier alternatives. At that point, absorption doesn't look like conquest. It looks like negotiation, policy alignment, quiet concessions, infrastructure dependence, labour reliance. Asset ownership shifting hands while everyone pretends it's just diversification. And markets notice these things long before politicians do. This is why serious investors watch border economics, not national anthems. Why real estate money flows south while financial narratives point north. Why hedge funds care more about Johor logistics than Singapore slogans. If you're still laughing at the title, good. Comedy is how denial protects itself. But if you care about capital preservation, property cycles, currency exposure, and long-term regional power, this question isn't silly at all. It's overdue. And this is just chapter 1. If you value uncomfortable truths over national bedtime stories, subscribe. If you enjoy watching economic myths get quietly dismantled with numbers, like the video. Next chapter, we compare this fantasy to places that already learned the hard way that money moves faster than borders. People hear absorption and immediately picture soldiers, sirens, and badly photoshopped flags on Wikipedia. That fantasy is comforting. It suggests danger arrives loudly, with advance warning. Reality prefers invoices. Let's start with Korean Peninsula. North and South were not divided because of culture, language, or even economics. They were divided by systems. Capital on one side, command on the other. And here's the part everyone skips. If reunification ever happens, it won't be because of tanks. It will be because one system becomes financially impossible to maintain. The bill matters more than ideology. Always. Now look at Taiwan and China. China does not need to invade Taiwan tomorrow. That would be stupid and expensive. Instead, it applies pressure where modern states actually bleed. Trade dependency, semiconductor supply chains, capital market access, insurance risk premiums, currency expectations. The question is not, will Taiwan fall? The real question investors ask is, At what discount should assets be priced under permanent uncertainty? That discount already exists. Markets are not patriotic. And then there is Hong Kong, the case study everyone pretends not to understand. Hong Kong was not crushed. It was financially integrated, legally adjusted, and slowly normalized. Capital adapted first. Property prices reacted. Talent moved. The skyline stayed the same. That's the trick. Absorption that preserves aesthetics while hollowing autonomy. No tanks, no chaos. Just revised rules and altered incentives. Now apply this pattern to Singapore. Singapore's power is not land, labour, or resources. It is credibility. The belief that contracts are sacred, money is safe, and the system is boring in the best possible way. But credibility is not a natural resource. It is a premium charged daily. Malaysia doesn't need to replace Singapore. It only needs to become good enough, while being cheaper. Cheaper labour, cheaper land, cheaper politics. Capital loves cheap when risk looks manageable. This is why smart money watches Johor, not speeches. Why developers quietly hedge south. Why logistics corridors matter more than flags. Why data centres don't care about national pride, only power stability and cost curves. Absorption in the modern era looks like this. Talent commuting instead of immigrating. Capital owning without governing infrastructure, shared, policy harmonised, leverage shifted. The smaller system becoming allergic to disruption because it cannot afford volatility. Singapore's nightmare scenario is not Malaysian dominance. It is regional normalisation, becoming one node among many instead of the indispensable one. And when that happens, asset prices adjust brutally. Stocks first, property next, retirement narratives last. This is why this topic makes people uncomfortable. It forces a shift from identity to balance sheets, from pride to probability. If you care about stocks, property, capital flows, and where the next premium quietly disappears, you already know this isn't fiction. If you don't, you're watching Geopolitics like a sports match while your portfolio plays chess. Subscribe if you want the chessboard. Like the video if you prefer numbers over national lullabies. Next chapter, we talk about the real battlefield. Property, debt, and why housing markets decide sovereignty faster than parliaments. Wars used to be fought with soldiers, now they're fought with mortgages. If you want to know who really controls a place, don't look at flags. Look at who owns the land, who holds the debt, and who panics first when prices stop going up. Start with Singapore's favourite national religion, property. Public housing looks safe because it's called public. Private housing looks prestigious because it's priced like a luxury asset. Both rely on the same invisible assumption: prices never fall in a way that matters. That assumption props up consumer confidence, retirement planning, and political calm all at once. Elegant, fragile. Now zoom out. Singapore property is no longer priced for Singapore salaries. It's priced for global capital that treats condos like Excel cells. When that capital finds a cheaper cell with acceptable risk, it doesn't argue. It moves. Enter Johor. Across the border, land is cheaper, labour is cheaper, and regulation is flexible enough to feel business-friendly instead of policy-perfect. Developers don't need miracles. They need yield. And yields don't care about national pride. This is where Singapore Exchange quietly connects to Bursa Malaysia through something far more intimate than diplomacy: capital structure, REITs, cross-border holdings, infrastructure funds, quiet joint ventures that never make the evening news. Absorption doesn't happen when borders disappear. It happens when balance sheets intertwine. Look at debt. Singapore households are asset-rich and cash-sensitive. That's a polite way of saying highly leveraged on property values. When rates rise, stress doesn't show up as riots. It shows up as delayed spending, softer retail numbers, and nervous policymakers whispering about stability. Malaysia's households, meanwhile, are less inflated on paper. Lower prices, lower expectations, lower leverage relative to asset value. Messier, less elegant, more resilient in a downturn. Now imagine a regional shock, not a crisis, just a long, boring stagnation. The kind advertisers hate and markets punish slowly. What happens? Singapore protects prices at all costs. Policy flexibility shrinks because confidence is fragile. Capital seeks yield elsewhere. Quietly, developers hedge across the border. Infrastructure follows money, not speeches. This is how economic gravity works. The smaller, richer system becomes risk-averse. The larger, cheaper system becomes attractive by default. Property decides sovereignty because it locks voters, retirees, and governments into the same bet. When that bet can't be unwound without pain, autonomy becomes negotiable. This is why smart investors track REIT exposure, cross-border debt, and logistics land, not national slogans. Why fund managers talk about regional integration while pretending it's just diversification. If you own property, this matters. If you own stocks, this matters more. If your retirement depends on stable asset inflation, this matters most of all. And if you're still thinking this is about Malaysia taking over Singapore, you missed the point. Nobody needs to take what willingly rearranges itself around capital. Like the video if you'd rather understand how money actually moves. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the adjustment instead of explaining it later. Next chapter, we go where the real leverage lives. Currency, labor, and why demographics always collect their debt. Everyone obsesses over borders. Money doesn't, labor doesn't, demographics definitely don't. This is where the fantasy really collapses. Singapore runs on imported humans, not tourists, workers, nurses, builders, cleaners, drivers, IT contractors, engineers. The system is polite enough to call this foreign talent, but the spreadsheet calls it cost control. Wages stay manageable because someone else's cost of living is lower. That someone else is mostly Malaysia. Every morning, tens of thousands cross the causeway. Every evening, they go back. Singapore gets productivity. Malaysia absorbs housing pressure. This is not brotherhood. This is arbitrage. Now add currency. The Singapore dollar is strong because credibility is priced in. The Malaysian ringgit is weak because politics are priced in. On paper, this looks like dominance. In practice, it's leverage with maintenance costs. A strong currency makes imports cheap and exports painful. It forces productivity to stay high forever. No pauses, no excuses, no aging population allowed. Unfortunately, demographics do not read policy papers. Singapore is aging fast, fertility is low, labor replacement relies on imports. But here's the awkward part no one likes to say out loud. Imported labor eventually wants rights, stability, or alternatives. When alternatives exist across the border, bargaining power shifts. Malaysia doesn't need a stronger ringgit, it needs options. Manufacturing upgrades, logistics hubs, data centers, anything that makes staying home slightly more attractive. When that happens, Singapore's labor advantage becomes a labor negotiation. Currency pressure shows up quietly. Companies hedge hiring by locating teams elsewhere. Salaries stop rising but costs don't. Consumption slows while asset prices are defended. Central planners start saying productivity more often than numbers justify. This is not collapse, it's compression. And compression is dangerous for a city-state whose entire value proposition is being the premium option. Demographics finish the job politely. Fewer young workers, more retirees, higher dependency ratios, retirement systems tied to market performance. Suddenly, stability requires growth that no longer comes naturally. At that point, integration isn't ideological, it's practical. Shared labor pools, aligned regulations, cross-border infrastructure, currency coordination discussions that start as cooperation. Absorption doesn't announce itself, it invoices itself monthly. If you're watching this for geopolitics, you're late. If you're watching for FX exposure, labor cost trends, and long-term equity risk, you're early. Like the video if you prefer incentives over slogans. Subscribe if you want to understand where leverage really lives before it's renamed regional harmony. Next chapter, the ending nobody wants. Why this fantasy persists, why it won't happen outright, and why denial is still the most expensive asset Singapore holds. So let's end the fantasy properly. No, Singapore will not be absorbed by Malaysia. Not legally, not politically, not ceremonially. There will be no announcement, no referendum, no dramatic moment where commentators pretend to be shocked while reading a script they rehearsed for 10 years. Singapore survives because it is exceptionally good at what it does. Governance, enforcement, contract credibility, financial plumbing. These are not small advantages. They are rare, and Malaysia does not want the headache. Absorbing a hyper-financialized city-state would be like adopting a nervous hedge fund that panics whenever volatility appears. Nobody sane volunteers for that. So why talk about this at all? Because the conditions that make absorption unnecessary are already changing behavior. Singapore's real vulnerability is not Malaysia. It is denial wrapped in success. The belief that property must rise capital will always prefer safety over yield, labour will remain grateful, demographics will politely wait, regional competitors will stay inefficient forever. These beliefs worked when Singapore was unique. They weaken when Singapore is merely excellent. This is how the story actually ends. Singapore stays sovereign, but it becomes more constrained. Policy choices narrow because asset prices must be protected. Wages rise slowly because labour is mobile. Returns compress because capital has alternatives. Regional integration increases because independence is expensive. Nothing breaks. Everything tightens. This is the ending markets understand instinctively and voters hate emotionally. And here's the final uncomfortable truth. If you are wealthy, this system still works. You diversify, you hedge, you buy exposure across borders and call it strategy. If you are middle class, this system asks you to believe longer. Hold property, trust retirement projections, accept stability as compensation for upside that never arrives. That gap is where resentment grows, quietly, politely, on spreadsheets. The fantasy of absorption persists because it gives people something external to fear. A foreign takeover, a villain, a story with drama. The real threat is boring. It's yield compression, it's demographic math, it's capital reallocating without asking permission. Singapore won't be absorbed by Malaysia, but parts of its economy already behave as if sovereignty has a price tag, and that price is paid monthly in mortgages, wages, and portfolio returns. If this series made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is usually cheaper than denial. Like the video if you value understanding over reassurance. Subscribe if you want analysis that treats money seriously and slogans lightly. This wasn't geopolitics, it was accounting.